Paul said, I fear that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your minds may be seduced from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. For if a person comes and preaches another Jesus whom we did not preach, or you receive a different spirit which you had not received, or a different gospel which you had not accepted, you put up with it splendidly. So Paul wanted to keep the church pure to Jesus, and yet he was worried that in the same way that the serpent came into the garden and told Eve, did God really say that you can't eat any fruit of the trees? Which God didn't say. And then he said, oh, when you eat it, you won't die. You won't really die. You'll become like God. God doesn't want you to become like him. He doesn't want you to have knowledge of good and evil. And what did Eve do? She turns, looks at the fruit, and says, man, that looks good. I want a bite of that. And she rebels against God and sins. And Paul said, in the same way that the serpent seduced Eve, these false teachers have come in among this church, and they're seducing them away from Christ. This is what Paul's concerned about. And so the problem with the church in Corinth is that when these false teachers came in and they started to preach a different Jesus, a different spirit, a different gospel, they should have realized it. They should have seen it. And yet they didn't. The church in Corinth did not recognize that the message of the false teachers was a counterfeit. Here's a picture of a $100 bill. Is it genuine or is it counterfeit? And how would you even know? How could you tell the difference between a genuine $100 bill and a counterfeit bill? Well, some of you might think, well, here's what I do. Line up all of the counterfeit bills that there are, and let me look at this counterfeit and that counterfeit. And if I can see all the counterfeits, then I can tell you if this bill is a counterfeit. I need to know the counterfeits, right? That's not actually what federal agents do when they try to determine if a bill is genuine or counterfeit. What they do is they take a real $100 bill and then they run it through a system of steps, a test. They're going to touch it, they're going to tilt it, they're going to look at it, they're going to look through it, and they're going to try to master knowing what's true. They want to master the marks of a genuine $100 bill. And the church in Corinth should have done the same thing. They should have known the gospel that Paul preached to them. They should have known Jesus so well that when the false teachers came in and they say something different, they say, whoa, wait a minute, that's different. That's a different Jesus. That's a different Holy Spirit. That's a different gospel. But they didn't. They fell for it. And so here's the first thing that we've got to learn from the mistakes of the church in Corinth in order to guard against false teachers. The first thing we got to do, know the truth so well that you can spot the counterfeit. In other words, you don't have to become an expert in CRT. You don't have to become an expert in New Age beliefs. You don't have to become an expert in Mormonism. You don't have to study all the world religions. You don't have to know how all of those things are false. You need to read the Bible and know what's true about Jesus. You need to know that Jesus is fully man and fully God, that he was never created, that he's always existed from eternity past, and that Jesus is the only way to God. You got to know that. So when someone says something different about Jesus, you immediately think, whoa, wait a minute, that's not Jesus. That's a different Jesus. You got to know that the Holy Spirit is the third person of the Trinity, and he indwells believers that we're born again. He gives us a new heart and helps us live a transformed life and gives us gifts to do ministry. You got to know that about the Holy Spirit. You got to know the gospel, that we're saved by God's grace through faith in the crucified Jesus. That's the gospel. We're saved by God's grace because what Jesus did at the cross. If anyone comes along and says, well, you're saved by faith in Jesus and what he did at the cross, but then you've also got to do this and this and this and this. It's like, wait a minute. That's not what Paul said. That's a different gospel. So we don't have to master all the counterfeits. We've got to know and be mastered by the truth. That's the first thing we can learn.